There is a number that has lived inside my chest for over 50 years. Not tattooed on my skin, not written in any file, just burned into me. 2,189. That's how many days I spent in a cage smaller than your bathroom. No sunlight, no news from home, no way of knowing if anyone was even looking for me. And here's the thing nobody tells you. The thing I'm going to tell you today that I have never told a single journalist, never told on camera, never told anyone outside of one person. The reason I survived had nothing to do with military training. It had nothing to do with willpower or toughness or God or luck. The reason I survived is something so strange, so unexpected, that when I finally told my wife, 30 years after I came home, she sat across the kitchen table from me, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" I'm going to tell you today. But first, you need to understand where I was, what that place did to a man, what it took just to make it to the next sunrise. So stay with me, because this story doesn't make sense unless you understand how dark it got first. Visual. Slow fade to old 1960s military footage. The sound of a helicopter blade. Part 1. Before the war. I was 22 years old in the summer of 1967. I had a girl back in Dayton, Ohio. Her name was Carol. She had brown hair and she laughed at everything. Even things that weren't funny. Especially things that weren't funny. I had a '64 Mustang, cherry red. I'd saved for 2 years working at a body shop after high school. I was supposed to marry Carol in the spring of 1968. We had the date picked. Her mother had already started looking at dresses. I was not a hero. I want to make that clear right now. I was a kid. 22 years old with grease under his fingernails, and a girl who laughed too loud, and a car he was prouder of than he had any right to be. When my draft notice came, I didn't run. I didn't protest. My father had served in Korea, my uncle in the Pacific. You just went. That's what men did in my family. I reported for basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia in September of 1967. 8 months later, I was in the jungle. Pause. I want you to understand something about Vietnam that most people don't grasp just from watching movies. The heat is the first thing. It's not just hot, it's alive. The air is so thick with moisture that your uniform is soaked through by 7 in the morning and it never dries. Not once. Your boots rot on your feet. The skin between your toes turns white and starts to peel. You stop noticing it after a week because there's nothing you can do about it. Then there's the sound. The jungle is never quiet. There are birds and insects making noise 24 hours a day. And after a while, your brain starts to play tricks on you. You start hearing things inside the noise. Voices, footsteps, commands. You can't trust your own ears. Our unit was the 4th Infantry Division. We were operating in the Central Highlands, up near Pleiku. I'd been in country for about 4 months when it happened. It was June 12th, 1968. I remember the date because it was Carol's birthday. I had written her a letter that morning. I remember folding it up, putting it in my breast pocket, thinking I'd find someone to hand it off to later. That letter stayed in that pocket for 6 years. Part 2. The day I was taken. We were on a routine patrol. 8 men. Moving through a valley northeast of Pleiku. I say routine. But there was nothing routine about any of it. Every step in that jungle was a negotiation with death. You're watching the ground for tripwires. You're watching the trees. You're watching the shadows. Our point man, a kid from Alabama named Delaney, Specialist Tommy Delaney, he stopped. He held up his fist. We all froze. For about 10 seconds, nothing happened. I can still feel those 10 seconds in my body. My heart rate went from 60 to 150 just like that. The sweat on the back of my neck went cold. And then the world exploded. The ambush came from 3 sides simultaneously. Later, much later when I was being debriefed after my release, they told me we had walked into a coordinated NVA ambush involving over 60 soldiers, 60 men, against 8 of us. I don't remember all of it clearly. Combat does something to your memory. It's like a film with frames missing. You have these snapshots, these frozen images, and then gaps. I remember Delaney going down. I remember firing and firing and firing until my rifle jammed. I remember a grenade landing 6 feet to my left and throwing myself behind a fallen tree. I remember the ringing, this enormous total silence that wasn't silence at all. It was my eardrums just shutting down. And then I remember hands, grabbing me, strong hands, pulling me up off the ground. I fought. I know I fought because of what my hands looked like afterward. But there were too many of them. The last thing I saw of that valley was Delaney, still on the ground, not moving. Later I would learn that 5 of the 8 men in my patrol were killed that day. 2 others were wounded and recovered. I was the only one taken. Pause. They marched me for what felt like 3 days. My hands were bound behind my back with rope. No food, small amounts of water. If I slowed down, they pushed me. If I fell, they pulled me up and pushed me again. I kept thinking, they're going to shoot me. Any minute they're going to stop and they're going to shoot me. They didn't shoot me. I wish in the early days that they had. The camp was deep in the jungle. No road you could find on a map. No landmark I could identify. They put me in a cell that was 8 feet by 4 feet. A bamboo cage essentially with a tin roof. A bucket. A sleeping mat that was more mold than fabric. And they closed the door. And that was my world for the next 6 years. Part 3. The first year, 10 POW, 1530. I want to tell you something about isolation that nobody understands until they've lived it. Human beings are not built to be alone. We talk about alone time like it's a luxury. A weekend at the cabin, a quiet evening. People say, I just need some time to myself. They have no idea. Real isolation, total isolation, day after day after day, doesn't make you peaceful. It doesn't give you clarity. It dismantles you, piece by piece. It takes apart everything you thought you were and leaves the pieces on the floor. By the end of the first month, I was talking to myself constantly. By the end of the 3rd month, I was answering myself. By the end of the 6th month, I had named the rat that came to eat scraps near my door. I called him Walter, after my father. I'm not telling you that to be funny. I'm telling you that because Walter the rat, a diseased jungle rat with a torn ear, became something like a companion to me. I looked forward to seeing him. I worried when he didn't come. The day I found him dead near the fence line was one of the worst days of my first year. You have to understand that to understand what came after. The interrogations began in the 3rd week. They wanted information about troop movements, unit positions, operational plans. I gave them name, rank, and serial number. That's the training. Name, rank, serial number. When that didn't satisfy them, they found other ways to ask. I'm not going to describe in detail what they did. Not because I can't. I can recall every second of it with perfect, horrible clarity. But because this story is not about them. I refuse to give them that space. What I will tell you is this. There is a moment, and every POW who has ever spoken honestly will tell you this. There is a moment when you make a choice. Not a dramatic choice. Not a movie choice where the music swells and you clench your jaw and you find your inner warrior. A quiet choice. A small choice. You decide whether you are going to be here tomorrow. That's it. That's the whole thing. You decide, am I going to be here tomorrow? And somehow, battered and starving and alone and terrified, I kept saying yes. Pause. But I need to tell you, I almost didn't. There was a night about 8 months in when I had made my decision. I had a piece of metal I'd worked loose from the frame of my sleeping mat over the course of several weeks. It had taken me a long time to get it free. I sat with that piece of metal for a very long time that night. And something happened. I'm going to tell you what it was, but not yet, because you need to understand the full weight of what I was carrying first. Part 4. Learning to live in a cage. Here's what they don't show you in the movies. Survival isn't one big heroic moment. It's 10,000 tiny ones. It's deciding to do push-ups in a 4x8 cell, because if your body stops moving, your mind stops working. It's rationing your food not just because there isn't enough, but because the act of rationing gives you control. And control, any tiny shred of it, is everything when someone has taken all of yours. It's learning the sounds of the camp so well that you know by the rhythm of the footsteps outside, which guard is coming, how far away they are, and what mood they're in. Knowledge is power, even in a cage, especially in a cage. I started doing something in the second year that probably saved my mind. I started building, not physically, in my head. I grew up watching my father build things. He was a carpenter, not professional, just a man who could make things out of wood, the way men of that generation could. Shelves, cabinets, a porch swing that my mother sat in every evening until the day she died. I started designing a house, in my mind. Every day, for hours, I would work on this house. I'd think through the foundation, the framing, the load-bearing walls. I'd figure out where the windows would face so the light would come in right in the morning. I'd design the kitchen so Carol would have counter space on both sides of the sink the way she always said she wanted. I built that house room by room over 2 years. And when I was done, I started over and built it better. I'm not speaking metaphorically. When I was released and eventually, years later, I did build a house with my own hands in rural Tennessee. The floor plan was almost exactly what I had designed in that cell, down to the placement of the kitchen window. That house still stands today. My granddaughter does her homework at the kitchen table I built. Pause. I also started teaching myself things. I spoke no languages other than English when I was captured. By the time I was released, I had, through listening, through desperate attempts at communication, through sheer obsessive repetition, pieced together enough Vietnamese to hold a basic conversation. I used that to learn things about my captors, about the camp, about the war, information, always information. The mind needs to feed on something or it turns on itself. I kept a calendar scratched into the bamboo wall behind my sleeping mat. Every morning, first thing, I made a mark. Not because I thought it would help anyone find me, just because keeping track of time meant time was passing. Time passing meant the possibility of an end. And I held on to the possibility of an end like it was the only rope keeping me above water. Because it was. Part 5. The middle years. By the 3rd year, I had settled into something. I hesitate to call it acceptance. I don't think it was that. It was more like adaptation. A species adapts to its environment or it dies. I adapted. I learned which guards would sometimes pause outside my cell a moment longer than necessary. The ones who were curious about me, or conflicted, or simply young and homesick themselves. There was one, couldn't have been more than 17, who used to squat down outside the slats of my door and just look at me. I started talking to him, slowly, using the little Vietnamese I'd built up, using gestures. He never spoke back, not for months. Then one day he said one word to me. He said, in broken, careful English, the word home. And I said, yes, home. He nodded very seriously, and he left. The next morning, there was a piece of fruit just inside my door. I still don't know how he got it. That boy, I never knew his name, left me small things 5 or 6 more times over the course of a year. A piece of food. Once, a small scrap of paper with what I believe was a hand-drawn map that I never decoded. Then one day, he was just gone. Reassigned, I assumed. Maybe something worse. I never found out. But those moments, that one word, home, those are the human threads you grab onto. The proof that even in the ugliest machinery of war, there are people inside the uniforms, on both sides. I've thought about that boy for 50 years. I hope he made it home. Part 6. The breaking point and the secret. Now, I need to go back to that night, the 8th month, the piece of metal. I told you I almost made a permanent decision that night. I need to tell you what stopped me. Because this is the thing I never told anyone. This is the secret that my wife sat across from and said, "Why didn't you ever tell me that?" I was sitting in the dark of that cell. It was maybe 2 in the morning. The camp was as quiet as it ever got. I had the piece of metal in my hand, and I started, I don't know why I started. I had not done this before. I started reciting, not praying. I wasn't a religious man then, and I'm still a complicated one now. reciting poems, pieces of songs, dialogue from movies I'd seen, commercials even, the stupid jingles you hear 1,000 times without meaning to learn them. I recited everything my memory held. And then, when I'd exhausted what I could remember consciously, something else started coming up. Things from childhood, things I didn't know I still had. My third-grade teacher, Mrs. Alderman, used to read to us on Friday afternoons. We'd push our desks back and she'd sit in the big chair at the front and read aloud for 30 minutes before the bell. She read us a poem once. I was 8 years old, and I didn't understand half of it. And I never looked it up after. I never thought about it again in 14 years. But that night, alone in the dark of that cell with a piece of metal in my hand, that poem came back to me, word for word. All of it. I don't know how. The mind keeps things you don't know it's keeping. And I sat there in the dark and I said it out loud, in a whisper, every line. And when I finished, I said it again, and again. And the piece of metal was on the floor, and I was still there, and I was still there in the morning. Long pause. That poem traveled with me for the next 5.5 years. I recited it every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. It became, and I know how this sounds, it became a kind of anchor. The specific weight of those words, the rhythm of them, proof that something existed outside that cell, that the world was large enough to contain beauty, that someone, somewhere, had once felt something deeply enough to arrange words in just that way. I've been asked what kept me alive. Journalists, therapists, other veterans. I always gave some version of the correct answer. Training, routine, the thought of home. Those things are true. But they're not the whole truth. The whole truth is a poem from a third-grade classroom in Dayton, Ohio, recited in a whisper, alone in the dark, for 6 years. Pause. The poem was If by Rudyard Kipling, and the line that got me every time, the line that put the metal on the floor that night, was the last one. And, which is more, you'll be a man, my son. I was 22 years old, and I was somebody's son, and I still had something left to be. That was it. That was everything. Part 7. Coming Home. I was released in February of 1973 as part of the prisoner exchanges following the Paris Peace Accords. I weighed 118 pounds. I had been captured at 174. I had not seen a photograph, a newspaper, a television, or a friendly face in 6 years. I landed at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and a nurse handed me a phone. I called Carol. She answered on the second ring. She had waited 6 years. No confirmed status for most of that time. I'd been listed as missing in action for the first 2 years, before my capture was finally confirmed through intelligence channels. 6 years. She answered on the second ring. I couldn't say anything for a long moment. She said, I knew you'd call. Pause. We were married 4 months later. That spring of 1968 we'd planned. We got it, just 5 years late. We had 41 years together before I lost her. She never stopped laughing at things that weren't funny. Pause. Coming home is its own kind of survival. People don't understand that. They think the hard part ends when you walk off the plane. It doesn't. PTSD didn't have a name back then. They called it adjustment problems. I spent years waking up in the dark, heart pounding, certain I was back in that cell. Years where crowds felt like threats, where I couldn't explain to anyone, not even Carol, for a long time, what was inside me. The house I told you about, the one I built in Tennessee, I think I built it because I needed to prove something, that I could still make something, that I could create a space on purpose, with intention, and put my family inside it and keep them safe. That's what I was doing every day in that cell when I was designing it. I was keeping my family safe, in my mind, the only place I could. People ask me what I want them to take from my story. I always have to think about that, because what I want to say is not what they expect. I don't want to tell you that you're tougher than you think you are. Maybe you are, probably you are, but that's not the point. I want to tell you this. The mind is a room you can furnish. Every book you read, every poem you hear, every piece of music that gets inside you, every conversation that changes you, you're putting furniture in that room. You don't know which piece you're going to need. You don't know which one will be there when everything else is gone. That poem was in me since I was 8 years old. I didn't choose it. Mrs. Alderman chose it. But it was there, waiting. 30 years of waiting. Fill the room. Read things that are hard. Listen to things you don't understand yet. Pay attention. Let the world put things inside you without knowing why. Because one day, in whatever darkness finds you, and some darkness finds everyone, you will reach for something, and you want something to be there. Pause. I am 79 years old. I still say that poem out loud every morning, not because I need it the way I once did, but because it brought me home. And I don't ever want to forget the way home. Pause. Thank you for listening to an old man. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more such amazing content.